Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of Rivals on Gran Turismo 6 in particular, and in this installment we're doing a three-way battle between what you could say are the three kings of speed on Gran Turismo 6, at least as far as more street-style vehicles go. That's not including stuff like the Tomahawk or the Red Bulls, and not even the Veyron, because although the Veyron could go up against these cars quite justifiably, I have also featured that one in another very similar three-way battle between the Veyron, the McLaren F1 and the TVR Speed 12, whereas on this occasion these tend to be the three cars in particular which people think of as being the kings of Special Stage Route X, whereas the Veyron, it certainly can be made to keep up with these cars. I do it all the time in mine, but it's not thought of in that same way. So we're keeping it more specifically to these three models: the Pagani Huayra, the Alfa Tz3, and of course the Nissan Gt-R Nismo. And what better track to test cars with a mix of handling and performance in a straight line than the Le Mans? So we'll break down each of the three cars on their own first of all in a kind of mini review. Then, of course, we'll pit them head-to-head in terms of lap times, on-paper numbers, and then combine it all together to see which one comes out on top, at least for the fun of it. So, let's begin. First up then, we have the Alfa Romeo Tz3. This is basically a case of Italian style meets American power, because under the Italian tux is Viper power, an 8.4 litre 600 plus horsepower V10 engine. It's front engine rear wheel drive, and one of the most notable things about the Tz3, even as far back as Gran Turismo 6's initial release, was how easy this car was, not just to make go fast, but also to drive at that speed around Route X. It is still by far the best handling of the three, as standard, around high-speed tracks. Even without changing the suspension or the gearbox, you could pretty much instantly get this car up to around 306 miles per hour just by upgrading the power. It's that good, that beginner-friendly, and that responsive to tuning. Now, of course, you can refine it even more, and people have over the years made it even quicker, but it's still kind of that initial benchmark. For a long time, people thought that this was the fastest car in the game, and it's only after others like the Veyron and the Huayra, and much later on the Nismo, started to become explored more, that people realised, well, actually no, the Tz3 isn't the all-dominant machine. What it is, however, is a brilliant all-rounder. It takes what the Viper could already do, but makes it even better in terms of performance and power, but at the same time offers a very good level of track performance. It's a very smooth car. Again, the Viper underpinnings give it a big advantage, because the Dodge Viper is a fantastic track car in both ACR and regular forms, and that shows overall, especially on a track such as here at the Le Mans. It's one of the quickest street cars in the game around this track, in both a straight line and surprisingly through the corners as well. What then about the newest of the three cars to Gran Turismo 6, the DLC Nismo Gtr? Well, the Nissan Gt-R Nismo is a massively popular high-performance car on Gran Turismo 6, or at least it was more so when people were actually still playing the game instead of just occasionally going on as they are now. This is one of the most dominant speed machines in the game. It doesn't accelerate quite as quickly as the Huayra, generally speaking. There are some people who have tuned it to be able to, but the thing about the Nismo is the overall speed is so high that there are very few things that can genuinely keep up with it. The Huayra is incredible. You can get it up around 309 miles per hour. It's notorious for doing so. But with the Gt-R, the Nismo in particular, I've known people who can get this to cruise at about 312 without NOS or draft. That's pretty incredible. Now, the Nismo is probably the most notorious of the three for having very heavy steering around Special Stage Route X, but I fixed that very early on using similar suspension setups to, well, a car that we'll get to in just a second, the Huayra. And once you tune it in the right way, it becomes a very easily dominant force, to the point where now the Nismo is probably more popular than the Tz3, possibly tied with the Huayra in terms of how popular it is around Route X. But being a GTR, you'd expect it to be pretty good around the track. Now, interestingly though, it was the slowest of these three cars, at least with my tuning, with me driving, and on this track. So of course there are tons of variables involved, but the fact remains, it was the slowest for me. about 2 seconds, or roughly 2 seconds off the pace of the TZ3. That did surprise me, because I wasn't holding back with the Nismo, and I did expect it to be quicker. Now, interestingly, the Nismo is, of course, the only car of the three to have an all-wheel drive advantage. That doesn't really work against it on this track, because I tuned it in such a way that it still handles fairly loosely over the front end, so it doesn't have too much understeer, but at the same time, I have to admit it wasn't quite as dominant as I expected it to be. I did assume that it would be quicker than the TZ3, and it didn't turn out that way. What then about the most powerful of the three, and the car which is often considered to be the quickest in the game, the Huayra? Well, of course, we battled Huayras head-to-head in another three-way match not that long ago as part of our Pagani Showdown. But how does it compare against its other rivals? Because Huayras are pretty much of a muchness. There are some differences, but they're all brilliant. With these three cars, though, their differences are much more noticeable. The Huayra is a lot more powerful than the Nismo, a fair amount more powerful than the TZ3, and it also has far more torque. In fact, it's the only car of these three to exceed 1,000 pound-feet. It's also very light though, which is certainly a huge advantage against the Nismo. Now the disadvantage, or the potential one, is a similar one to the Veyron, and that is that the Huayra is very naturally brilliant in a straight line, but not around corners. The Veyron is extremely heavy and unresponsive around the track, whereas the Huayra is the exact opposite. It's very slippery, very twitchy, almost like it's trying to be good, but has so much power in peak form that it's difficult to keep it in check. Now with the tune that I was using, as you can see from the lap time result, it was the quickest of the three. And not just by a small margin. I managed to make my Huayra significantly quicker around this track than both of the other cars. Even though I wasn't trying to make that the case, I was pushing all three cars the same amount, but the Huayra did win by a decent enough margin. Now in a straight line, the Huayra is known for its top speed, but as I've said, both of the other cars are very close, and with the right tuning, they almost break even in terms of their overall potential. But where the Huayra often beats out the other two is for acceleration, because the Nismo has decent acceleration, but it's known more so for its top speed. The TZ3 is pretty good at everything, but not as strong anymore as it used to be, especially not as dominant. The Huayra, though, not just has that great top speed, but it gets there so quickly. And of course, the Huayra for a long time was considered to be just undrivable in the earlier days of Gran Turismo 6, and one of my personal tune setups for it not only became notorious on the channel, but also became notorious in the Gran Turismo community in general, because way back in the early days of GT6, I was dominating almost every Route X lobby that had Huayras in, because I tuned mine in a totally different way. It became nicknamed the Golden Bullet. Many of you guys will probably still remember those days early on in Gran Turismo 6. And it was one of those tune setups, one of the rare ones in fact, that I kept the suspension setting secret on because of how dominant it was. Later on though, I released the full tune and more people started to benefit from it. Now, of course, I'm not the only person to make the car improved, but in those early days you really noticed the difference a lot more than now. Whereas the car has had the most refinement, I would say, of the three. The TZ3 has got a little bit better, the Nismo's certainly been improved, but the Huayra has had massive improvements. Initially, it's already dominant, but they've made it even better. The tuning community as a whole really did a lot of work for the Huayra. And it shows. It's great around the track now, not necessarily as easy to drive as the other two, but as the lap time bears out, certainly potentially dominant. So that's it for the breakdown of the three individually. How do they compare, though, on paper? Well, let's find out. First of all, then, we have, as usual, the price. And this is that one point where the Nismo really does run away with it. It's so much cheaper than the other two. 154 grand is brilliant value, considering 605 grand is the price of the Alfa, and then more than double that again is the price of the Huayra at 1.35 million. Now, I would say that all three cars are still worth their respective prices, but the fact is, for sheer value, and bang for buck in particular, the Nismo is a far superior machine. As far as engine capacity goes, well, as I've said before, biggest isn't automatically best, as of course the Wankel rotary engine just goes to show, but we are doing these matchups in a very top trump style way just for the fun of it, so sure, we'll give the biggest engine the number, and so of course the Alfa TZ3's Viper engine pretty easily wins in that regard, especially over the Nismo. As far as PP level though, interestingly none of these three, despite being so dominant and so fast, three of the fastest street cars in the game in fact, none of them have a flat floor. At least not as an upgradable option. That's kind of surprising, especially in the case of the Nismo, because the Black Edition does have that as an option. So it's interesting that you can't improve this one even more by revising the flat floor setup and giving it the race spec one. But still, the PP level would be probably insane if you could do that to it. And, speaking of the Nismo, that is the car that wins in that regard. Not by a huge margin over the Huayra, and even less so the Huayra with less power, that sits at 694 PP, but either way, the Nismo wins out on that point. As far as power though, it's a pretty easy win for the Huayra, especially given that it's the more powerful of the two Huayras at 1,247 horsepower. Which isn't a huge amount more than the Alfa Romeo, but that's a pretty decent margin above the Nissan. Of course, all three cars are huge in terms of power anyway though. As far as torque, as I mentioned earlier, it is more of a runaway victory for the Huayra being almost 1,100 pound-feet, given that the other cars aren't even at 1,000. The Alfa's pretty close, and then the Nismo's nowhere near, but still, 836 pound-feet is not bad. Don't undersell that car, it's incredible. That is a huge amount of torque to have. As far as weight, again, the Huayra wins out because it weighs 1,105 kilos, which is around about 140, 150 kilos less than the Alfa, but a lot less than the Nismo. There's not even close between the two. Even the Alfa and the Nismo aren't that close. There's over 100 kilos between them. As far as horsepower per ton, well, it's lighter and more powerful, so of course the Huayra is going to pretty easily win out there. Again, all three cars are great. 850 for the Nismo, 970 or close enough for the Alfa, but 1,129 horsepower per ton for the Pagani. That's massive. That really is. Even for a race car like a prototype, that would be impressive, but for a car which still weighs over 1,100 kilos, to have over 1,100 horsepower per ton, that's pretty remarkable. And of course, as always, we don't award the lap times a point because, as I mentioned earlier on, with me, my tuning, the choice of track, the choice of weather even, there are just far too many variables for it to really be fair to give any one car a point. But, that being said, it is interesting to note that the Huayra was the quickest, then the Alfa, then the Nismo. Not too surprising. There are certainly people I think who would have predicted that to be the outcome. Personally though, as I mentioned earlier, I did expect the Nismo to beat the Alfa. Overall though, I did assume that the Pagani would win, because although all three have that great top speed, and of course Le Mans requires that, even with the chicanes, I did think, and it did prove to be the case, that although the top speeds are pretty similar, that the Huayra would get to those speeds so much more quickly. And I'm sure you noticed from the replays that the Huayra was going much quicker down the Le Mans straight. And so, overall, as a tabulation of all of those scores put together, that means that coming in third is the Alfa Romeo with 1 point, engine capacity, an interesting advantage to have. Then, in second, it's the Nismo with both price and maximum PP level. Those are some pretty good advantages to have. But, of course, coming in first with 4 points is the Huayra with power, torque, weight, and horsepower per ton. So some pretty significant advantages you could say for the Huayra, and some good ones for sure for the Nismo. The price advantage alone is a huge one to have, especially for people who don't have huge amounts of money to be thrown around on Gran Turismo. But overall, all three cars are by definition worth looking into, and although they all accomplish the same thing essentially in a straight line to varying degrees, they go about it in very different ways. The Huayra is the only mid-engine car of the three, the Nismo is the only all-wheel drive car of the three. They all have their own unique spin. V6, V10, V12. Take your pick, and regardless of which one you do pick, they're all brilliant. But that's it overall for this particular installment of Rivals. Of course, I'll see you guys next week, and as always, thanks for watching.